What if later on, after the company wrote off a specific customer's account, what if in that rare event the customer ended up paying us? What would we do? That's what we see here in example 2, part 3. All the same information, but now we're adding, assume that on March 15th, Randall Company pays the $1,000 amount that Brown had written off on March 1st. What do we need to do? The first thing we need to do is reinstate. So this was our write-off. Let's undo that write-off to reinstate that customer's specific account. So now I want to debit accounts receivable in order to undo this account receivable that I have here. And I want to credit allowance for doubtful accounts, so that the net effect of these two entries is that nothing took place. Okay, I'm still not finished. I still haven't recorded the cash receipt, but let's post this. So accounts receivable has now a debit of 1,000, and I'm going to put it in this row here so we can see that it's a wash. Accounts receivable was unaffected, and the allowance for doubtful accounts is a wash here as well. Now we've received the cash, so we record the receipt of the cash, and then what do we need to do? Reduce the customer's specific accounts receivable balance. So we no longer have the right to claim that 1,000. Let's write some notes related to collecting an account that had previously been written off. So if a receivable that was written off, this is a rare event, is later collected, record the following two entries. One, we're going to undo that entry for the write-off. In other words, we're going to reinstate. And to do that, we debit accounts receivable, credit of the allowance account. And two, we record the collection of the cash. Debit cash, credit accounts receivable. Okay, let's move on. How does a company come up with how much its bad debts expense is going to be? Let's go back to our example where we had example 2, parts 1, 2, and 3. Part 1, we said the credit manager estimates that $10,000 of the sales or credit sales will be uncollected. So one method of estimating is to say, what is our sales, or more specifically, what are our credit sales? And then just apply some rate to that to say what amount is going to be uncollected. So bad debts expense can be estimated, the amount of the bad debts expense can be estimated as 1, a percentage of sales, or sometimes more specifically credit sales, because a cash sale is not going to have any bad debts expense associated with it, of course. And in that case, bad debts expense is calculated simply as sales, or credit sales if that's what's being used, times some percentage uncollectible. And so where's this percentage uncollectible coming from? Well, the manager just estimates it. They look at what's happened previously, they look at economic conditions and say, you know, in my industry and past years and under the similar economic situations, maybe 1% or 5% of my credit sales or total sales is never going to be collected. And then we just multiply those two numbers, sales times percentage uncollectible, and that's our bad debts expense for the debit, and the allowance for doubtful accounts would be credited. Another way is to say a percentage of not sales, but of accounts receivable. And then, so there's two ways within, you can see there's a lot of things we're dividing into two classifications here. If the company uses a percentage of accounts receivable method, they're going to take some rate of uncollectible, apply one rate to the net balance in accounts receivable, or use an aging schedule. And the aging schedule says we're not just going to take the net amount of accounts receivable, let's say 100,000. We're going to say of our $100,000 receivables, how many are current? How many are 200 days past due? Because it's much more likely that we're not going to receive those receivables that are 200 days past due compared to the ones that are current. Now, regardless of whether the company is using the one rate applied to net accounts receivable or uses an aging schedule, when we're calculating bad debts expense using the percentage of receivables method, it's more complicated than using the percentage of sales method. And the reason why is because what we need to think about is what is our existing balance in allowance for doubtful accounts. That we need to take into consideration when we're determining what is the amount of bad debts expense. So calculating bad debts expense using the percentage of receivables method requires taking into account the existing or current at the time that company is making this estimate of bad debts expense balance in the allowance account. We'll come back and write down some more notes related to how do we take into account, what do we do as we start this next example. Let's move to example 3. Wilson and Company uses an aging schedule. Now, if they didn't use the aging schedule, if they just did percentage of receivables, some net number, their net accounts receivable is this $547,000. So the company could say, well, 3% of our receivables will never be collected, and that's going to be the required amount in our allowance for doubtful accounts. But instead, this company says, let's get more specific. The accounts that are over 120 days past due are much more likely to be uncollectible as compared to those that are still current. And management has given us these rates. These are not rates that we need to calculate. These are the amounts that some manager has decided based on past experience and economic conditions is the likelihood of non-collection based on the aging. So what is the dollar amount of receivables that are under 30 days due? That is this $345,000. So I'm going to multiply that 345,000 times the rate or the percentage that management expects to be uncollectible. They expect that they will not collect 0.8%, so less than 1% is deemed uncollectible. In the 30 to 60 day bucket, receivables are 115,000, and management expects that 4% of those will be uncollectible. 61 to 90 days, 18,000. That gives us, of this 18,000, we think we're not going to collect 2,700. 91 to 21 days, 14,000. And over 120 days, 55,000. So what is our required amount? Remember, we're not saying what is bad debts expense. We can do that when we're using the percentage of sales or percentage of credit sales method. But if we're looking at using the percentage of receivables method, what we do is we're determining what is the required balance in the allowance account. 26,610, the sum of each of these numbers here, based on the aging analysis. That's not necessarily what we're going to book as bad debts expense. This is what we want in the allowance for doubtful accounts. Next, determine the amount of bad debts expense, assuming that the company has, and this is really important, no existing balance in its allowance account. Okay, so here I've given you this ledger account. We see that there's no existing balance. I want you to think of when we're using the percentage of receivables method, our entry for bad debts expense is always the amount that gets us to our required ending balance. So I'm going to start with my required ending balance in the allowance account, which is 26,610. Then I'm going to take into consideration the existing balance. This is easy in this scenario, which is 0. And so the amount of the bad debts expense is, of course, 26,610, right? So this is the amount of bad debts expense is what I need to record in order to get to my required balance. Remember, this 26,610 came from this 26,610 here. And so that's what I need to record to get to my required ending balance. So my journal entry is going to be a debit to bad debts expense of 26,610 and a credit to the allowance account for 26,610. But now let's change our assumptions. Now determine the amount of bad debts expense, assuming the company had an existing credit balance in its allowance account. So this is really important. The credit balance of 800. Okay, so this is what it would look like visually. We have an existing 800. Remember, we want this 26,610. That's what we solved for up here. Our amount of bad debts expense is going to be, what do we need to record to get us to our ending balance? So 800 plus X equals 26,610. So I need to subtract out the beginning balance. I need to only add 25,810 in order to get to my required ending balance. So again, just like I did earlier, I had my required ending balance, and I won't always have ledger accounts here. So I want to get used to saying my required ending balance is always my starting point. My existing balance is no longer 0. My existing balance is 800. So my bad debts expense, because I had a credit, let me just write that this is a credit. Remember, the required ending balance is always a credit. It's possible I may end up with an existing balance of a debit because we overestimated at some point. We were wrong in our estimate, but we always want a required ending balance that is going to be a credit. So what do I need to record? Well, if I already have a credit, I need to record less. And this is going to be, so I subtract out the credit balance in the allowance account. Now, again, it's possible that we could have an existing debit balance in the allowance account. Now, this would happen because in the past, we must have written off more than we had estimated in our allowance for uncollectible accounts. And so now we need to adjust for that. Remember, we're always starting with our required ending balance is this 2610. It's going to be a credit. But now we don't have a credit, we have a debit of 1200. So what do I need to do? Well, I need to wipe out this debit of 1200 and record enough that I get it up to 2600. So I want to add that debit balance. I'm recording even more. Why? Because in a past period, my bad debts expense was too low. I ended up writing off more than I had estimated. That's fine because remember, we're always estimating. We don't know exactly what should be written off and what should be estimated as bad debts expense in the period of sale. Okay, so bad debts expense is 27,810. We see that's more than, oh, I forgot to do my bad debts expense entry in the last example. So let me continue here and then I'll go back. So bad debts expense is going to be the 27,810. The accounts never change for our entry. It's always a debit to bad debts expense and a credit to allowance. Now let me go back. I forgot to do the entry in the last account. The bad debts expense entry is going to be 25,810. So in each of the different scenarios, we see a different amount of bad debts expense. So I just want to point out the importance of understanding when we're using the percentage of receivables method, we need to account for what is the existing balance in the allowance account. Let's continue on with our notes. When using the percentage of receivables method to determine bad debts expense, first determine the required balance in the allowance account. Next, record bad debts expense equal to the amount that will allow the allowance account to have its required ending balance. What do we need to get it there to its required ending balance? So if the allowance account had a debit balance before we booked our entry, then bad debts expense is going to be equal to the required allowance balance plus the existing debit balance. right? That's what we saw here in part three, the part three, this third scenario. There was a debit balance, so we add. Now let's say, what if there's a credit balance? Then we always subtract. So if the allowance account had a credit balance to start with before we booked our adjusting entry for bad debts expense, our bad debts expense is equal to the required allowance balance, and then we subtract out the existing credit balance. That concludes our videos for the video information for accounts receivable. In class, we're going to work through a bunch of additional problems on this.